Cindy Winland, and I'm with the Just Transition Fund, and I'm here with Amy McMurrow-Hunter with the Climate Economy. And together, our organizations, with the help of sponsors and displayers and people like you who are here today, we're looking forward to a really interesting day, looking at the new economy that is resulting as part of changes in our energy mix and the climate. So, a little bit, the Just Transition Fund, we are sponsoring the event today, and we are an organization of philanthropy that started roughly 4 years ago in response to the change in the energy mix and the impact that it had been having on communities. And so we saw that communities were suffering from economic decline, loss of jobs, sometimes changes in land use, and other kinds of things that happen when the energy mix changes. And so we're here as a neutral party, although we have a point of view, and you can see all the detail on our website. But we're here, and our organization exists to help fill gaps, and we're a hybrid organization. We provide funding to groups that are working on transition in communities, local groups working on transition. And we also provide technical assistance, and I lead that program. And our technical assistance ranges a whole span of things depending on what a community or a group needs. So it includes things like this, which is bringing new and interesting ideas and people together, to providing resources, to providing funding, to helping put the right stakeholders in the room, all kinds of things. Our focus is on the coal transition, and we work nationwide. But in general, when we look at economic development or economic impacts of the energy transition, it spans all kinds of changes in energy. And we'll hear from our first keynote speaker about some background, Seth Feaster, about that, and I'll go through the agenda in just a little minute. Amy is the founder of the Climate Economy, which is an organization that focuses on the new energy economy and the value that that can provide to businesses and jobs and communities. And Amy will speak more about the detail and describe her organization better than I can during our first panel, which she'll be the moderator. A little bit about what's happening today. If you don't have we're calling them a program, it's a 2-page sheet, front and back, that just lays out our table sponsors, the order of events for today. I think the logistics are fairly easy. We have snacks in the back, there's bathrooms out in the hallway, and feel free to do whatever you need at any point in time. We're also going to keep a strict timetable today. We want to give everybody opportunity to speak and ask questions, and also respect your time and not delay lunch, of course. But one of the important things to note here is that if you don't have a chance to ask your question, not to worry, there will be plenty of networking time, and hopefully everybody is wearing a name tag, so you'll be able to identify who's who. So let's see. We have a couple other things. I just wanted to talk about the course of the day a little bit. That we're going to have 3 keynote speakers, and we're going to have 3 panels. We're going to try and talk about Seth Feaster from the Institute for Energy, Economics, and Financial Analysis. Did I get that right? Outstanding. Seth Feaster is going to start us off today and lay some of the groundwork about where the energy economy is today, why things are changing, and what we can expect to see in the future, and a little bit of detail about Illinois. Then we'll have a panel on the discussion panel on energy in general, with you can see from your list who's on that. I won't go through that. Then we'll have another keynote from Dr. John Eichert, who is here. He's the Professor Emeritus of Agriculture and Economics from the University of Missouri, who will be speaking with us, followed by lunch, and then another panel on economic diversification, where we have a great group of people coming together to talk about all the economic opportunities that are out there as a result of the energy transition, and hopefully we can spawn some discussion about thinking a little bit differently about how economic development can happen. Then we have our third keynote, which is Albert Bates, an author speaking about biochar, and Albert will also be having a full-day workshop tomorrow in this same location about biochar. And then finally we'll have an innovation panel on exploring new ideas in the energy mix and business models for Southern Illinois that can be beneficial. A couple of just quick mentions that this event here is also spawning several other things that are going on, and I'll list them here. I've also had a request to plug another meeting, so I'll list them in the order that they occur. The first is the Illinois Biochar Group has a meeting next Friday, July 19th in Goodfield, Illinois. Paul Anderson is here today, who can give you, he is in the back here, to give you any more detail you'd like on that. And two things that we're really excited about that are outcomes from this event. On June 20th, the Sustainability Commission will be meeting at the Civic Center here in Carbondale. And then the Science Center in Southern Illinois in September will be having Youth Climate Economy Ventures. And I think I'm going to let Amy talk a little bit more about that and the other initiative that is being spawned by this event. Or, if you like, I can talk about the Youth Climate Economy Ventures right now. Would you like
I can talk about it later.
You can talk about it later? Good. All right, let's do that. Well, then with that, if there are no burning questions before we get started, then I would like to introduce Seth Feaster. Seth, would you like to come on up here? And I'm going to read Seth's bio. You could read it on the website, but as with all our speakers, they're pretty impressive, so we want to be sure that we give you the full background. Seth has been in energy data analysis for what we call IEEFA, Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, for 4 years with a focus on U.S. thermal coal industry and the power industry, which uses the vast majority of that coal. This focus also includes staying current in market developments, energy efficiency, renewable technology and projects, power grid management, and advances in energy storage. Prior to working with IEEFA, Seth worked for a year at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, helping to manage public communications on the web, creating digital charts and graphics, and guiding content management. Before that, he spent nearly 25 years as a journalist, specializing in creating maps and charts with a focus on business, the economy, and energy at the New York Times. Seth has a BA in Geography from the University of Vermont and a Master of Science in Geography from Bristol University in Bristol. Outstanding. Well, thank you, Seth. So let's welcome Seth.
Thank you. It's nice to be here in Carbondale, in one of the hearts of coal country in this country. My mandate today is to try and give you a very broad overview of what's happening with the energy transition, as it's been called, specifically as it relates to coal. And that obviously has tremendous impacts here in Southern Illinois and in the entire region around here in Kentucky and Indiana as well. So you will see that my graphic background, there will be a lot of maps and charts. And I hope you can follow along, and I'll try and leave some time for questions at the end. So my presentation today is really in 3 parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the overview of the coal industry and what's happening. I'm going to talk about more specifically the electric power transition, or this energy transition as it's being called. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the market-driven impacts on coal-fired power. Our focus at IEEFA is to really look at these issues through an economic and financial lens. We, of course, have interest in climate, but this is really about economics. It's about finance. So I'm going to kick this off with a look, a long-term look at U.S. coal production. You can see here that it has risen for decades in this country after the Second World War, but then in the last decade or so it has gone into tremendous decline. This is national level production figures. We estimate, and these figures are based on EIA, that decline in production is going to be about 45% from its peak in 2008. That's not very long ago, by 2020. 45% decline in overall production of coal. That's pretty huge. There are three main regions, broad regions of coal production in this country. The western region, which includes some mines in the southwest, in Utah, for example, Colorado, but primarily we're talking about the Powder River Basin, which is in Wyoming and Montana. Tremendous open pit, surface mining operations, relatively low sulfur, relatively clean. It was a period of enormous growth for several decades, but that has now started to go into decline. Unfortunately, in this contrast here, it's very tough to see the interior. But it's been the interior, which includes the Illinois Basin, has been relatively flat in terms of production, although it's down almost 40%, but it's not as much in some ways as some of the other regions. The math behind understanding the U.S. coal industry is relatively simple. I'm going to show you a diagram in a second. The coal industry is really about thermal coal. There are two kinds of coal. There's metallurgical coal, which is used in steel making, and there's thermal coal, which is used to burn, produce heat in power plants primarily. Thermal coal is also, for a period of time, used in people's houses and on the railroads and in industry. But these days, 90% of thermal coal goes to the power industry. So 90% of U.S. coal is thermal coal, and 90% of thermal coal goes to the power industry. So the risk profile it's all about the electric power industry. We don't use it in steam engines anymore. It's all going here. So the changes in the power industry is all that matters for the most part to what's happening, to understand what's happening in the coal industry. So these two charts show that relationship, the difference between metallurgical coal and thermal coal in terms of production here. And as you can see, in terms of exports, which are often talked about by the coal industry, three-quarters of the metallurgical coal is exported, but only a tiny fraction of thermal coal is actually exported. So we're really talking about the domestic power industry consuming this coal. And that's in the second pie chart here. Over 90% of this in 2017 went to the domestic power industry. However, consumption of coal by the power industry has been dropping and has been steadily declining since around 2007. You can see here, this is quarterly consumption. The red line indicates sort of a rolling 4-quarter average, which gives you a better idea. So you have seasonal spikes here, but this gives you a better idea of the trend, the red line. And the red line is clearly moving down. So a quick look at exports. So exports, which are sometimes touted by the coal industry as the savior. As you can see here, usually half or more of exports are metallurgical coal, and I'm not going to talk about that. And what you have left is thermal coal exports, but this is a fickle market. The U.S. transportation costs to overseas markets can be relatively high, and so depending on the price of coal overseas and transportation costs, the U.S. can either be competitive or not very competitive in this market. And so you see these big swings in levels of exports. It's not something that the coal industry should depend on when it's this fickle. And the result is, and this is essentially what the energy transition is about. What you see here is that this is a chart showing the mix of fuels used by the power industry to generate power. So coal in the last 10 or 15 years has gone from being about 50% of the fuel used to generate power in this country to close to 20%. It's a huge change. Well, what has changed? Natural gas and renewables are the two things that are replacing coal. And as you can see here, natural gas has essentially gone in the opposite direction as coal, and renewables, and by renewables here we generally mean wind and solar, are rapidly growing. And they're rapidly, well, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But this, in essence, is the energy transition when people talk about the energy transition. There are other elements of this, but this, for the electric power industry, is really the big thing that's going on. So what is driving this energy transition? There's obviously talk about regulation, there's other kinds of conversations. From our point of view, we don't think that those are particularly productive because they don't get at the root economic causes of what's going on behind this transition. I mean, they're important. You know, some of these other discussions about climate, about regulation, obviously are incredibly important, but I'm going to take a different approach today here to talk about some of the reasons why this is happening. So from my point of view, there are about 7 different technological disruptions that are happening. And technology disruptions are incredibly powerful economic forces. All you need to do is think about the switch to cell phones or PCs or any other kind of technology that has sort of swept across the economy, and you get the idea of what a technology disruption can do. So I've identified 4 kinds of disruptions that are happening on the generation side, and 3 other kinds of disruptions that are happening on what I call the grid side. So the first one, so the 4 on the generation side are energy efficiency, which is 2 things. Energy efficiency is not just about LED light bulbs, it's also about the way the economy works. If we don't have to use as much energy to produce goods and services in this country because we're using software, people are writing software instead of doing heavy machinery, that's a lower demand for power. And so what we see around the world, and especially in the United States and Europe, is that the demand for power in the economy has shifted. I'm going to talk about renewables, which is wind and solar, but they're 2 very distinct kind of technologies, even though they're lumped together. And I'm going to talk especially about fracking for a few minutes. On the grid side, there are 3 things that are really important that are happening. One is integration, so the ability of grid operators, the power system operators, to put many, many kinds of wind and solar resources on the grid, even though they're often described as variable. The ability to do that has really been a big change. Grid independence, the ability of whether it's homeowners or companies or commercial or industrial operations to be able to generate their own power, either through power purchase agreements or directly by putting solar panels on your roof. That is a big change. That doesn't mean that you're going off the grid. So we're not talking about cabins in the woods that don't have to be attached to the grid. We're talking about Walmarts that have, several, have a lot of panels on their roof, and they're able to generate their own power for that store, for example. And the last thing is energy storage, which is coming out of partly because of the electric car industry that's been developing. But the battery technology, this is a rapidly changing and rapidly growing area. It's not really having a huge impact just yet, but we're just at this tipping point where it's starting to change a lot of things about how the grid operates and about the energy mix. So I'm going to talk a little bit in some detail about some of these things. So the first point that I would like to make here about energy efficiency is this kind of a quiet revolution. For years, the U.S. economy has seen tremendous growth in power demand. This is from 1950 all the way up until 2007. There was sort of this unending growth. And then something changed in about 2007. And it's not just because of the economic recession that we had, because for now, almost a decade, there's been very little growth in power demand. That's a combination of energy efficiency and changes in the economy, because we've had 10 years of economic growth since then, and the power demand has not increased significantly. This is incredibly important, because if power demand was still growing, you would need every power plant in the country to operate in order to provide that power. So what's happening now is every time you build a new power plant, because demand is not increasing, you end up pushing something else out. So you build a new natural gas plant, and the power is cheaper, you push off an older coal plant that is more expensive. This is pretty important. There has been a tremendous growth in both wind and solar. So I think you may appreciate it more out here than on the coasts, but wind power has really had an enormous impact across the Great Plains and in the Midwest. And it's been growing relentlessly. And it's not really a new thing. And wind power is probably about 10 years ahead of where solar is today. Yet solar is probably going to grow faster than wind, simply because it's much easier to install solar, especially at the utility scale. The other thing on the generation side that's happened is fracking. So in terms of disruption, fracking is really about the ability to drill horizontally and to use hydraulic pressure to release natural gas and oil from shale formations. Now, the impact there has been tremendous. So that's a new way of drilling. It has released all this new kind of resource that was previously unavailable, and that has changed the economics of natural gas in this country. You can see here that the impact of shale gas, as it's called, has had. This revolution also started around 2007, and between 2007 and 2017, there has been just a phenomenal and rapid growth in shale gas production. That has pushed prices for natural gas down and kept them down. It appears that, and from the markets, what the markets are telling us, it's likely to stay, the prices are likely to stay low for a while. That has put tremendous competitive pressure on other fuels because natural gas is relatively inexpensive. Tough to see here, but essentially, this slide is meant to show that there's been tremendous growth. It's not really showing up, unfortunately. But there's been a tremendous growth in power generation at the state level. In 2008, there were 4 states, North Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, and Colorado, that generated 5% or more of their power at the state level. Today, that's 21 states. Okay, and some of these states, like your neighbor in Iowa and Kansas, they are generating tremendous amounts of power, a third or more of their power from wind on an annual basis. It's even more dramatic if you look at it on a monthly level, because some places are generating half or more of their power in some months from wind. So there's tremendous growth and impact of wind power. Now, the interactions between gas and renewables and coal is very important. And it's having a big impact on how this is playing out in power markets. So gas by itself is undercutting coal on price. And there's an emissions advantage to natural gas. Wind and solar by themselves are also undercutting coal on price. In some parts of the country, they're undercutting gas on price. But together, and this is an important aspect of this, together, natural gas and renewables work really well together, because natural gas power production can be ramped up and down very quickly in order to match the up and down production of solar power and wind power. Although I will say this, solar and wind are much less variable today than most people think. It's not like if the wind, it's often said, well, if the wind isn't blowing, the lights go out. It's not like that. There's tremendous amounts of resources in this country where these things are producing a lot of power most of the time. But the other thing is that coal doesn't do what natural gas does. You cannot ramp up a coal plant and turn it down the way you can with a natural gas plant. This is why often there's this argument about baseload coal, where the coal plants run all the time, but the reality in the power industry today is that that's not really an option to match the needs of the power industry. So natural gas, that's another reason why gas power has been rapidly replacing coal. Okay, so here are some of the consequences. This gives you a quick, again, it's tough to see, but all these dots represent coal plants in this country. You can see there's a lot of them, and they are a little bit variable in size, but they're pretty much all over the country, largely concentrated right around where we are right now. Peak capacity for coal production, coal generation. Capacity is a measure of how much power a power plant could produce. Doesn't mean it will produce it or is producing it. It's how much can you produce. That peaked in only 2011, so relatively recently, but it's been falling very quickly. It's down almost 25% since 2011. And that's through the end of 2018. Why has that happened? Well, there have been a lot of retirements. I'm sure you're all aware of coal plants retiring. That's been a big focus. In recent years, including last year, there were tremendous amounts of coal retirements. And there's more coming. But there's a big problem in terms of just looking at that, at the coal power plant picture as sort of one uniform market. This country, the capacity of coal-fired plants largely rests in the 102 largest coal plants in the country. You can see from here there are about 346, or at least there were in October, 346 operating coal plants in this country, but those 102 largest really account for 2/3 of all the capacity in the country. That's not a big number, 102. It sounds big, but it's not a particularly big number. The focus by some on retirements is it's important, because if you're retiring a coal plant, it is not going to be producing power anymore. It's gone. But that's a little bit misleading. There's another thing that really matters, which is how much are those coal plants actually running? And so we did an analysis that looks at what those 102 plants were doing in 2007 versus how much they were running in 2017. And what you can see here is in 2007, this is really the end of the era of baseload coal. These coal plants are running most of the time. 80% of them, 79% of them, are running 70% of the time or more. Okay, so they're basically running all the time. By 2017, only 19% of those 102 coal plants are running 70% of the time or more. In fact, 40% of those coal plants are running less than 50% of the time. And if you're not running your plant very much, your operating costs start to add up. If coal gets much more expensive, it's not just about fuel, it's about how much it costs to run a plant. And coal plants are not cheap to maintain and operate. Because they're not running all the time, that makes it even more expensive. So I'm going to go back, and now we're going to look a little bit more, so that was the 102 largest. I'm going to look a little bit more comprehensively. The next chart is going to focus on the 2011 bar. So I'm going to do some math for you here with that 2011 bar and look at all the power plants in the country. Okay? So this is a picture of what's happened since 2011, since that peak capacity. So you've had about a quarter of all the coal capacity in the country close, permanently retired. Then, it's a little tough to see here, can't really see it, I guess. There's another 10% already that we're expecting to retire between this year and 2024. So in the next 6 years, there have already been announcements by power companies that 10% of the capacity is going to close. So that leaves us with the other 2/3. And we're going to look at how much they're actually running. And it turns out that a lot of the remaining plants, coal plants in this country, are not really running very much. Once again, you can see that over 20% are running less than 50% of the time, and another 30% are running less than 70% of the time. So, this idea that coal is a baseload source of power is sort of a myth, because most of these plants, 50% of the remaining plants, are not even running 70% of the time. That is having a tremendous impact on the cost of running these coal plants and their competitiveness against other fuel sources. So I'm going to turn my attention now to, so how is this going to play out a little bit? I'm not going to take too long here, but how is it going to play out in the Illinois Basin? So right now, tough to see. I apologize about that. There's actually a map of the U.S. in there. And if you know where Prairie State is, you might be able to orient yourself. Seminole is in Florida. Bowen is in Georgia. And there's a little pink dot up at the top there that is in Michigan. So this is the coal use by power plants, the coal coming from the Illinois Basin. Okay? So you can see that a lot of the coal that's sold is really concentrated here in southern Illinois, southern Indiana, and northern Kentucky. So the places that are consuming this are, for the most part, around here. The yellow dots are the 10 largest consumers of Illinois Basin coal, and the pink dots are the rest of them. And you can see here, those 10 largest users of Illinois Basin coal account for 50% of all the coal produced here. Okay, so it's very concentrated. That means 10 power plants use 50% of the coal from the Illinois Basin. So even though there's 48 power plants served, those 10 make an enormous difference. Again, a little bit tough to see, but the point here is these are the plants that have already been announced that they're going to retire that use Illinois Basin coal. So you can see that plants far away, you've got C.D. McIntosh and Big Bend in Florida. Big Bend is actually being converted to natural gas. Local plants, including Paradise and Brown, both AB and EW Brown. Some of these plants right around here are being closed in the next 6 years. And some of the others further away, Loman in Alabama and Filer City in Michigan. Those plants are also being retired. So the world of the marketplace for Illinois Basin coal is shrinking. So I'm going to turn a little bit to the good news and the bad news about how the energy transition, as I've explained to you here, is playing out at a more local and regional level. So the coal industry is obviously an enormous player in some parts of the country, and particularly in the Powder River Basin. Most of the regional and state economies of Montana and Wyoming, especially Wyoming, are very dependent on coal. Very little economic diversity there. So, and in this particular area, right around here, there actually is a relatively large dependence on the coal industry, and that means both mining and consumption of power plants. Okay, and the less diversified these economies are, the bigger the impact, and that impact can be devastating and particularly at the local level. You can have the loss of power plant jobs when the power plant shuts down. You can have the loss of coal mining jobs, especially if the mine is relatively close to the power plant. So those two things together can really devastate the jobs in a very small area. We are looking at the closure of Navajo Generating Station in Arizona. There is one mine that provided coal to that. All of those plant jobs and all of those mine jobs are being lost more or less at the same time. Now, there are some mitigating things about that because there's going to be mine reclamation work, but that doesn't employ everybody. There's going to be decommissioning work at the power plant, but that doesn't employ everybody. But there's more of an impact, a broader impact. And I don't know if any of you here work for local or regional, county level administration, but tax revenue and royalties is a tremendous part of the economic impact here. Some of these places are going to lose big percentages of their school budgets, big percentages of their overall budgets, because the taxes and the royalties are not going to be coming in anymore. And that's happening at the same time as you're losing your job base. So this is a tremendous compounding of the economic impact that can happen in some of these smaller communities. And there's another thing. When coal companies go bankrupt, as Westmoreland recently did and Cloud Peak has recently filed for bankruptcy, they've cut retiree health benefits, they've cut pensions, and that is a longer term problem for a lot of communities, because if you have a retiree that was counting on that money coming in, they're not going to have that money to spend it over the next 2 or 3 decades as they age. That is a lot of money that can disappear from communities without communities even being fully aware of how they're being undermined. So that's a real problem. Responses in these communities often begin after considerable deterioration in the local economic picture, or the complete loss. Like if a mine is suddenly announced to close down, or a power plant is suddenly announced to close down, and nobody's prepared for it, that can be a very rapid change and a rapid financial loss to try and deal with and adjust to. And in some places, and I'm not a tax expert, but in some places like in Wyoming, there are specific laws about how the tax structures work that actually exacerbate this problem. They don't allow smaller towns and communities to have rainy day funds or collect more taxes for making adjustments. And so there are some structural policy problems that can lead to even worse outcomes. I got another page of bad news. And then there'll be good news. So one of the things that happens in local areas is they say, first thing is you get defensive and reactive, like we need to keep the plant open, we need to keep the mine open, we're going to do everything we can to do that. Well, that may be admirable, and it's a completely understandable response. However, planning for these kinds of enormous economic changes and adjustments takes time. And often in what we see in these communities is the time that should have been spent preparing for the closure of plants or the closure of mines is, I hesitate to use the word wasted, but it's misdirected, perhaps, at trying to keep a plant or a mine open. And that time is then lost in terms of your ability to prepare for these changes. Okay? And that can have a tremendous impact, because the more prepared you are for these changes, the better off you're going to be. I want to point out that areas far from political or economic sectors are often hit harder because they're not going to get the attention from the state or the feds that if this were happening in the state capital, it would. That's a harsh reality. But Southern Illinois is far from the tax and political power center in Chicago. And that makes it more challenging to get help and to convince politicians in the State House in order to help distant regions. There's another problem, which is that the Illinois Basin and the coal region, where all these power plants are, is split up between Illinois, Indiana, and Western Kentucky. That makes coalition building and getting attention from 3 different state houses and coordinating among those political entities even more challenging. Wyoming is going to have, in some ways, a better chance of dealing with this because it's all on Wyoming. They've got to deal with it entirely themselves. But when it's split up between 3 different states, it makes it even more challenging. Competing interests. So, you know, some of the focus has been on devastated coal communities. Very understandable. But there are competing interests here. There is the natural gas industry, which has created a tremendous number of jobs and is paying a lot in taxes and has replaced coal in a number of these areas. There are ratepayers. We all pay for electricity. Ratepayers don't want to pay more than they have to. And so ratepayers are out there advocating for lower electric costs. Well, if coal is expensive, ratepayers don't want to subsidize that. Okay, so you're going to run into competing interests. It may sound great in order to help certain sides, but there's always going to be some winners and losers potentially. The other thing that is important to note is that, you know, speaking here in Carbondale, smaller, more rural communities often have less expertise at the local level and fewer resources to respond to these kinds of dramatic changes. It doesn't mean they can't. Rural communities have one thing that lots of places don't, which is a tremendous amount of drive and willingness to try and solve some of these problems because it affects the entire community, and the community often is much more able to pull together when it's given some help in order to meet these kinds of challenges. Now there's some good news. So when you have, not entirely true here, but in general, because of the way that the power system was developed, there are a lot of large power plants that are in more urban areas, okay? The revenue from those power plants and the jobs all went to those more urban areas, more developed areas. The big change about this energy transition is that wind and solar power have to be located across a broad area, or they certainly can be. And so what that means is that turns that old formula on its head. The revenue from wind and solar facilities often goes out into the rural economy and not the urban economy. That can mean lease and tax and payment in lieu of tax payments that go to a broad area of rural communities. Okay, that can mean for a lot of farmers, it can mean a very important alternative to agricultural income. It can mean long-term revenue streams. Some of these power purchase agreements are 25 years, so you can plan around that revenue stream coming in from the lease payments or the power production payments. And that planning is very important. It means that you can add jobs in your school district because you know that revenue is going to be coming in year after year. It means you can do infrastructure planning because the revenue is going to be coming in year after year. There have been places that have tried to respond to this by short-term taxes. If you put up a wind turbine, we're going to make you pay a big tax on it. The problem with that is it's a one-time revenue gain, and then it's gone. And so a lot of that money gets squandered. It either goes to reduce taxes in very short term, or it goes for other kinds of projects that are very short term, and it doesn't really stay in the communities. There are other benefits to that more distributed income stream. It means that, again, the money tends to stay in the local or regional economy that we would have sent somewhere else to a big corporation or to some other area. And it also can lower the cost of power in your area, and particularly rural electric co-ops. And it can reduce or eliminate the potential legacy cost of some of these extractive industries. And there are some other benefits, and then I'll wrap up. There are a lot of improvements from this transition to grid resiliency because you have your power generation resources spread over a bigger area, and they're not as dependent on certain kinds of conditions. The possibility of energy independence, something that's been talked about in this country for a very long time, the possibility of true energy independence at a lot of different scales is now available. So whether it's the farmer who can put up a solar panel, or the Walmart that can put up a solar panel, or an industrial operation that can put up solar panels, or purchase, a big data center that can purchase wind power, the ability for local areas across a much broader region of the country to generate its own power is now available. And that is only going to grow with the advent of storage. But I'm not going to talk much about storage at this point. But these are some of the really good things that are happening. And overall, this energy transition is lowering the cost of power for ratepayers. And we're all ratepayers now. So at that point, I'm going to wrap it up and take questions.
Recently, I watched a documentary, I want to call it Burned, where they're using wood, logs to burn in power plants. England is taking forest logs from southeastern United States all the way across the Atlantic to keep power plants going. And I want to say those were former coal plants. On the UP in Michigan, they're burning railroad ties, which is poisoning the air for that village. Your comments on that?
Well, look, I mean, sometimes I come from the state of Vermont, which has a wood chip plant in Burlington, Bernie Sanders' hometown. It was an effort at energy independence. It is, in theory, carbon neutral, but like most things, there are advantages and disadvantages of stuff. In the bigger picture, burning railroad ties is not a long-term solution for energy needs, as well as it doesn't solve, some of the problems of pollution and toxic waste that coal plants have. The costs in general at coal plants of dealing with coal ash and the toxic waste products, not just coming out of the smokestack, is tremendous. And those costs are not fully accounted for in a lot of these communities and in the price of power that we pay. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Let's give him one more round of applause.